That old man is blocking my legroom. The businessman sneered from his seat in economy, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. The 78-year-old veteran only shifted quietly his voice, barely above a whisper, as he apologized. No one moved. No one made eye contact. Until a young woman in first class pressed the call button. "I want to switch seats," she said. "Give him mine." Hours later, a flight attendant leaned down and whispered 6 words that stopped her breath. "He knew your grandfather. He remembers." And when the old soldier stood to speak, the entire cabin rose with him, not in protest but in silent, thunderous respect. The moment the woman in seat 1A stood up, the flight attendant paused mid-stride. Nobody noticed at first. After all, passengers don't usually make a scene in first class, especially not passengers like Clara Jensen. Young, polished private. The kind of woman who could be in a magazine one day and invisible the next if she chose. But what she said next, quietly, calmly, changed everything. "Please give him my seat." The attendant blinked. "I'm sorry," that veteran Clara said, pointing beyond the thin curtain, separating luxury from discomfort. "Switch us. I'll take his seat." 3 rows back in the cramped section of economy, the noise hadn't died down. In fact, it had grown louder, sharper. "That old man is blocking my legroom." The man in the aisle seat barked, his voice thick with impatience and entitlement. Frank Delaney sat still, back hunched as much as his spine allowed, a weathered navy cap resting gently on his white hair. His duffel was tucked neatly beneath his seat, and his hands, scarred, steady, rested on his lap. He looked up at the angry man beside him, confusion flickering across his face like a shadow he recognized too well. "I'm sorry, sir," Frank said softly, shifting slightly as if willing his joints to bend just a little further. "My legs, they don't fold like they used to." The businessman snorted, shaking his head. "Well, maybe you should have booked extra legroom, huh? I paid for this seat. I don't want to spend 3 hours jammed against your knee." A few heads turned, then quickly turned back. The unspoken contract of public life kicked in: don't get involved. Eyes dropped to phones. One woman adjusted her child's headphones. Another scrolled faster. Clara Jensen didn't scroll. She had noticed the man the moment he boarded, trailing a limp and a dignity that felt older than the airplane itself. He had walked slowly but not weakly, more like someone measuring each step with intention. His cap read U.S. Navy with a small Vietnam service pin clipped beside the embroidered gold letters. To most passengers, he was just another old man boarding late. But Clara noticed details like the kind of duffel military men used to carry before wheels became the norm. Like the crease in his slacks that suggested he still ironed his own clothes. Like the silent pain in his shoulders as he tried not to inconvenience the world around him. She'd seen pain like that before on her grandfather's face decades after he'd come home from a war nobody wanted to talk about. Her grandfather had called it ghost weight, the kind of heaviness people couldn't see but never stopped caring. She set her book down and pulled off her headphones. The curtain between first class and economy rippled in the draft from the galley, and she stood smoothing her jacket and reached for the call button overhead. Miss Jensen, the attendant, approached with a practiced smile, unaware of what was unfolding behind her. Clara gestured toward the back. "I'd like to change seats." "Is something wrong?" "No," Clara replied. "But something back there is." Frank Delaney had spent most of his life reading rooms before reading people. As a former Navy senior officer, you learned to observe quietly, to speak last. But there was no mistaking what was happening here, and no mistaking how it felt to once again be spoken to as if his presence were a burden. He had flown hundreds of times. Never once had someone complained about the way his legs shifted, but never had he felt more in the way. "I'm sorry," he repeated again, quieter this time. The businessman didn't answer. He had already put his earbuds in and was scrolling through a tablet like the moment hadn't happened at all. Frank leaned back, exhaled slowly. He stared out the window. Not in anger. In quiet resolve, the kind forged by decades of doing things that no one would ever see. That's when the flight attendant reappeared. She approached him gently, like one might approach someone still waking from sleep. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "would you mind coming with me?" He hesitated. Why, we'd like to move you. Miss Jensen has requested it." "Requested what?" "To switch seats with you." Frank blinked. "I didn't ask for anything." "I know." She asked for you. He glanced around. A few people were watching now, but no one said a word. The businessman didn't even look up. Slowly, with the grace that had never left him, even if his knees had Frank stood. And as he walked down the aisle, passengers quietly parted. He didn't understand what was happening, but somewhere in the silence a shift had begun. Something invisible had started to echo like footsteps on an old parade ground, or the ripple of a salute that moved beyond uniforms. Clara Jensen looked up as he arrived. She said nothing. She simply stepped aside, handed him the aisle to 1A, and offered a quiet nod. For now, that was enough. Frank Delaney hadn't sat in first class since 1984, and even then it was by accident a standby upgrade on a half-empty military hop to D.C. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't a clerical fluke or a technical error. This was deliberate, and that made it harder to accept. He sat down in seat 1A slowly, cautiously, like it might vanish beneath him if he leaned back too far. The leather was soft and the extra legroom felt almost surreal after years of flying knees to tray and coach. A crisp white cloth covered the tray table, and someone had already placed a bottle of water at his side. The attendant brought a warm towel. Frank stared at it. He hadn't seen a towel offered on a plane since they stopped handing out peanuts. He glanced around, then back at the young woman, now taking his former seat in economy, Clara Jensen, he'd learned from the murmur of the attendant. She didn't look back. She simply opened her book calmly, like nothing had happened, which in her mind maybe nothing had. To her it might have just been a quiet act of decency. To Frank it cracked something wide open. First time in first class, Frank turned to the voice beside him. A tall, silver-haired man in a blazer was watching him with a friendly smile and the air of someone who'd flown too often to be impressed anymore. "Is it that obvious?" Frank replied, adjusting the navy cap on his head. "Not really. But the way you're holding that towel, like it might explode." Frank chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, bit out of my element." "Well, welcome," the man said, extending a hand. "Charles Whitmore, retired judge. I take this flight every other month." Frank shook his hand firmly. "Frank Delaney, retired Navy. I don't fly much anymore. Only when it matters. Family." Frank nodded. "Granddaughter's graduation. Northwestern. That's a proud trip." Frank leaned back and let the weight of those words settle into the silence. "First in our family to get a college degree," he said after a pause. "She called me last year crying about finals, and I told her, 'You finish what you started, kiddo. That's what we do.' I promised her I'd be there." Charles smiled. "And now you are." Frank swallowed. "Thanks to that young woman." They both looked toward the back of the plane, though the curtain blocked their view. Charles sat quietly for a moment, then asked, "You mind me asking about the hat?" Vietnam, Frank said. "And later, Desert Storm. I was 19 the first time I deployed. 31 when I came home the second time. You saw both ends of it then." "I saw more than I care to remember," Frank said, "and less than I wish people remembered." Charles tilted his head, understanding immediately. "Hard coming back." Frank nodded slowly. "Harder than the war. You don't expect parades, but you don't expect spit either." His voice didn't waver. It had steadied over the years, shaped by repetition, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, saying the truth would make it easier for someone else. "I was homeless for 2 years. Portland. Slept under a bridge near Burnside. People used to cross the street just to avoid eye contact." "How'd you make it out?" Frank hesitated, then smiled. "Hardware store owner. Guy found me shivering in his doorway one winter night. Gave me coffee. Gave me a job a week later. Let me sleep in the back room until I got clean." Charles raised an eyebrow. "That's rare." "Yeah, he didn't treat me like a project. Treated me like a man. We stayed friends for years." Frank looked out the window for a long moment. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. "His name was Robert Jensen," he added softly. "Ran a shop on Fremont. Had a kid and a granddaughter about yay high," he gestured. "Never asked for anything in return. Just believed I still had something in me." The name hung in the air like a low hum. Charles didn't speak. He didn't need to. Something about Frank's tone had shifted. Deeper now, like a tide rolling in beneath calm waters. In the back of the plane, Clara turned a page without reading it. She felt the stare of the man beside her, the same businessman who had complained earlier. But he didn't speak. Not anymore. The air around him had changed, the energy subdued. Clara wasn't looking for thanks, and certainly not from him, but she did notice how he suddenly gave her a bit more room. The flight attendant passed by quietly, then doubled back. She leaned down and whispered, "Miss Jensen? His name is Frank Delaney." Clara looked up surprised. "The man I switched with?" "Yes. He's telling a story about someone named Robert Jensen. Said your grandfather helped him when he was homeless." The book fell from Clara's lap. Her breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" she whispered. The attendant nodded. And just like that, the storm that had stirred beneath the surface, beneath the civility, beneath the silence, rose up in her chest. This wasn't just kindness. This was legacy. This was full circle. And something deep inside her shifted forever. Clara Jensen sat frozen in her cramped economy seat knees, grazing the plastic tray in front of her. But she didn't feel the discomfort anymore. Her hands gripped the sides of the paperback she wasn't reading. She stared ahead, eyes wide, mind racing. Frank Delaney, Robert Jensen. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her grandfather never talked about his acts of kindness. He was a quiet man, a man who built things with his hands and believed in keeping your head down, your words strong, and your generosity private. If it's real, he used to say, you don't need credit for it. She had always admired that about him. But now, hearing that name whispered by the flight attendant, she realized there was more to the man she loved than she'd ever known. She looked down the aisle. The curtain to first class was still drawn. She couldn't see Frank, but she could feel something changing, like the plane had shifted course mid-air, not geographically, but spiritually. Meanwhile, in the front cabin, Frank Delaney was telling his story. He didn't mean to. Charles Whitmore had only asked one question. But the kind way he listened, the respect in his posture, it unlocked something Frank hadn't shared in years. "You know, I didn't start drinking until I got back," Frank said, his voice quiet, steady. "You'd think war would do it. But no, it was the silence after. That's what got me." Charles nodded, offering no interruption. "I lost my job within 6 months of returning," Frank continued. "Then the apartment. Then my marriage. I kept thinking, this can't be it. This isn't the ending I signed up for." He rubbed the back of his hand absent-mindedly, a scar still faint on his knuckle from where glass had once split it open. "Portland winters don't care about your medals," Frank muttered. "You either find shelter or you don't. I remember squatting under that bridge, pulling my coat tighter, wondering what the hell happened to me." Then he paused. "Until the night Robert Jensen found me." Charles straightened slightly. The name again. Frank didn't notice the shift. He was too deep in the memory now. He didn't ask questions. Just gave me a coffee in a clean mug, not a paper cup. Sat beside me. Told me, "You don't look like a man who's done." I told him I was. He didn't argue. Just gave me his card and said to come by in the morning. Frank smiled faintly. It wasn't a handout. It was a ladder. He looked out the window. The clouds stretched like cotton over the world below. He let me sweep floors, then run the register. Let me stay in the storage room till I could afford rent. Said I reminded him of his brother who never came home from Korea. Charles didn't speak, but he was no longer just a listener. He was witnessing something. "That man saved my life," Frank said plainly. "He made me believe I was still a man, not a burden, not a headline, just Frank." "He ever ask for anything back?" Charles asked gently. Frank chuckled. "Only that I help the next guy when it's my turn." Then he turned slightly. "And now his granddaughter gave me a first-class seat just because I existed." "You know she's his granddaughter?" Charles asked, leaning forward. Frank shook his head. "No, just a feeling." She's got his eyes, that quiet kind of strength. Behind them, a flight attendant lingered. She'd been coming by to offer drinks, but now stood still listening. And just like that, the seed of the story began to spread. Within minutes, the whisper moved from seat to seat. "Did you hear the veteran? The young woman. Her grandfather helped him. It's like fate." Clara sat in silence. The flight attendant returned, crouching beside her row. "He's still talking," she whispered. "Told the whole story. And he said my grandfather's name." "Yes," said Robert Jensen, gave him a second chance. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run up the aisle. She wanted to hug this man who had carried part of her grandfather's legacy without her even knowing. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you," and looked out the window. Her grandfather had passed away 5 years ago. She had missed him every day since. But now, in a way, she never expected he was here again alive, in the memories of a man who had been quietly carrying that kindness like a torch through the darkness. Back in first class, Frank folded his hands in his lap. "I never got to thank him properly," he said to Charles. "Sounds like he didn't need it," the judge replied. "He knew what he'd done." Frank smiled. "Yeah, but I always wished I could have told his family." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Maybe," he said, glancing toward the back of the plane, "you still can." The seatbelt sign remained on, but the stillness in the cabin had little to do with turbulence. From row 2 to row 32, the passengers aboard Flight 214 were no longer just travelers. They were participants, reluctant at first, then transfixed in something that none of them could explain, but all of them felt. It started as a whisper, a kind act, a quiet veteran, a girl who gave up her comfort for a stranger, and then the connection, one name, Robert Jensen. That was the spark. And from that spark, the fire moved, seat by seat. "Wait, you mean the guy in first class knew her grandfather? He said Robert saved his life." "No way. That girl is Jensen's granddaughter." By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the story had spread like wind through wheat. There was no announcement, no social media post, no photo, just the old-fashioned transmission of emotion, of awe, of reverence. The flight attendants began to act differently. They moved slower, now more intentionally, exchanging glances with each other and with passengers who offered soft nods. Kindness had taken command of the aircraft. Back in first class, Frank Delaney sat in silence. The story he shared was now out of his hands. He hadn't meant to make a scene. He didn't even know what Clara's name was until someone mentioned it again. Clara Jensen, the attendant, had whispered when she returned. "The woman who gave up her seat. She's Robert's granddaughter." Frank's breath hitched. "You're sure she didn't know who you were either?" "Until now." Frank looked ahead, his hands resting on the folded towel in his lap. The name Jensen still echoed inside his chest like a drumbeat he hadn't heard in years. The man who lifted him from the gutter, who offered a job instead of a warning, coffee instead of judgment. And now his granddaughter had unknowingly honored that same man by honoring Frank. He rubbed his temples. The moment felt bigger than any words he could summon. In economy, Clara sat still as a stone. She hadn't spoken since the attendant confirmed the story. The man beside her, once smug and impatient, hadn't said a word either. He shifted awkwardly, unable to look at her. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe shame. But Clara didn't even notice anymore. Her mind was somewhere else, decades in the past, in a hardware store, with her grandfather handing coffee to a man with tired eyes and a proud heart. It all made sense now why her grandfather used to stare out the window longer than necessary. Why he never let anyone call the homeless bums. Why he insisted on giving second chances even when the world said no. She remembered the photo. It used to sit in the garage, taped to the back of a dusty toolbox. Two men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a store with a crooked sign that read, "Jensen and Comer, Repairs Tools Trust." She never knew who the second man was. Until now. 10 minutes later, the curtain to first class fluttered open. Frank Delaney stood. He didn't move right away. He just stood, straightening his jacket, smoothing the brim of his navy cap. His legs wobbled slightly, but his bearing was unmistakable. The stance of a man who had once stood in formation, saluted commanders, and led younger men into storms that didn't always pass. And now he was walking into a different kind of formation, rows of strangers who had quietly become witnesses. He made his way down the aisle slowly. No one said a word. No one stopped him. No one needed to. In fact, something remarkable happened. One by one, passengers rose from their seats, not in protest, not in curiosity, but in something older, something deeper respect. Heads nodded, eyes softened, aisles widened. By the time Frank reached row 17, more than half the cabin was standing. Clara rose too. She turned, unsure whether to smile or cry. The old man before her looked like he had seen 10 lifetimes, but his eyes were clear, fixed on her, like she was the only person in the world. He extended his hand. "Miss Jensen," he said, voice strong but full of emotion. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did." Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't anything." "No," he replied gently. It was everything. He paused, then added, "Your grandfather saved my life. You gave me the chance to thank him." Clara's breath caught. "I never knew. He never told me." Frank nodded slowly. "That sounds like Robert. He didn't need to speak kindness. He lived it." Around them silence held like a sacred pause. Then from somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another, and another, until the entire cabin joined in a rising tide of thunderous, silent respect. No speeches, no cameras, just a plane full of people realizing that they had witnessed something rare, something good, and in the middle of it, two strangers, no longer strangers, bound by kindness that had echoed through decades and finally miraculously found its way back home. By the time the plane touched down in Chicago, everyone on board had heard the story either from a neighbor, a flight attendant, or from witnessing it firsthand. Yet no one rushed to deplane when the seatbelt light dinged. People stayed in their seats not because they were asked to, but because they felt they were part of something sacred, and rushing would cheapen it. Frank Delaney stood slowly. Clara Jensen rose with him. The moment wasn't choreographed, but it might as well have been. As they began walking together toward the front of the plane, the cabin parted again, not out of curiosity this time, but reverence. Some reached for phones, but many didn't. Some wiped tears. Some just nodded. When they stepped off the jet bridge, flashes met them. Somehow the story had already reached the terminal. A few journalists were waiting near the gate. Microphones, cameras, wide-eyed producers. "Miss Jensen, is it true you gave up your seat, mister?" "Delaney, how do you feel about the attention? Were you really saved by her grandfather?" Clara didn't stop. She kept walking, gently placing a hand on Frank's back as if shielding him. When one reporter pressed in with, "Will you be posting about this?" Clara finally turned. "No," she said softly. "This wasn't about content. It was about connection." Then she added more firmly, "Please respect that." The cameras slowly lowered. Later that evening, Clara accompanied Frank to his granddaughter Melissa's graduation at Northwestern. She hadn't planned on it, but when he asked with tears in his eyes and that same quiet dignity, she couldn't say no. She wore jeans and a sweater tucked in quietly beside Frank in the bleachers. No one recognized her, not because she wasn't famous, but because she was finally where she belonged. No spotlight, no podium, just family. When Melissa walked across the stage and waved, Frank's voice cracked. She did it. First one in the family. Clara squeezed his hand. Not the last. That night she saw something she would never forget. In Frank's modest living room outside the city, he brought out a faded photo album. Inside was a picture of a younger Frank, hollow-eyed but hopeful, standing beside a man with a thick mustache holding a mug of coffee. "Robert Jensen, her grandfather." She gasped. "That's the photo from the garage. He let me sleep in the back of his shop," Frank said, voice almost reverent. "Taught me how to sand down doubt. Said most broken things just needed time and hands that didn't give up." Clara traced the photo gently. "He never told me, because the best men don't," Frank said. "They just do." By morning, the story had gone viral. A passenger from the flight someone Clara had never even seen had posted, "Watched an Olympic athlete give up her first-class seat for a vet. Turns out the vet was once homeless, until her grandfather gave him a job." Decades later, she gave the family's kindness right back. No speech, no cameras, just decency. The whole plane stood in silence. Within hours, the post had over 400,000 shares. TV anchors discussed it in morning news cycles. Veteran groups reposted it. Airlines issued statements about upgrading uniformed veterans when available. But Clara remained silent. She didn't issue a press release. She didn't do interviews. She didn't monetize a moment that was never meant to be seen. Instead, she posted one sentence on her social media: "Kindness isn't a performance. It's a continuation." And then she logged off. Weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at Frank's home. It was from a young man in Ohio who had seen the viral post. "My grandfather served too," it read, "and he died alone thinking nobody remembered. Your story helped me understand that remembrance isn't always about medals, it's about moments. Thank you for reminding me." Letters kept coming, some from veterans, some from grandchildren, some from people who had simply been passengers on other flights, and now looked a little longer at the man in uniform or the woman with the cane and the quiet eyes. And for Clara, the world changed not on billboards or cereal boxes, but inside. She began working with a small nonprofit helping veterans re-enter the workforce. No big announcement, no rebranding, just hours spent resume building and listening to stories like Frank's. "You're not lost," she told one man. "You're just waiting to be found by the right hands." At the first annual benefit dinner, Frank was the guest of honor. He didn't speak long, but when he took the mic, he scanned the crowd, cleared his throat, and simply said, "Robert Jensen once gave me back my dignity. His granddaughter gave me a chance to return the favor." That's what legacy is. It's not about being remembered. It's about helping someone else be remembered too. He turned to Clara and smiled. "Some kindnesses echo for generations, but only if we let them." And so on one plain and one quiet act, a legacy was renewed. No medals were awarded, no headlines lasted. But somewhere between takeoff and landing, the world had changed. Not because someone was great, but because someone chose to see someone else clearly, fully, and without condition. And sometimes, that's all it takes to carry the weight of the past into a better future. In a world moving faster than ever, it's easy to forget the quiet people who carry heavy stories. A seat on a plane, a cup of coffee decades ago, a young woman's small act of kindness, none of it seemed world-changing at the time. But together they became a legacy. A reminder that in America, we don't just honor our heroes once a year, we honor them through how we treat each other every day. Frank didn't ask for recognition. Clara didn't seek attention. But somehow their lives reminded all of us that respect isn't earned by noise, but by quiet acts of decency repeated over time. So here's a question for you. Have you ever witnessed or done a small act of kindness that echoed louder than you expected? Have you ever seen someone quietly carry forward a legacy of honor, even when no one was watching? Share your story in the comments. Let's remind each other what still matters in this country. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that decency should never go out of style. Because sometimes, the smallest seat change can shift the course of a life, or even just maybe the world.